Hey guys, tonight we begin with something grand, something dusty, something barely remembered, but far too interesting to leave in the footnotes. You're not sitting on a throne yet, but you're about to follow the silk-threaded trail of China's only female emperor, Wu Zetian. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize dynasties or drink bitter tea from a cracked porcelain bowl. Just picture this: a little girl born in the shadows of carts and copper coins, who ends up steering one of the world's biggest empires while most men were still figuring out how to hold their robes without tripping. You probably won't survive this story, not because of any danger, but because we're about to slow down so far into ancient China that your brain might start snoring before your body does. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born in the city of Lizhu, Sichuan province, around the year 624 CE. It smells like horse leather and fermented grain, and your family isn't royal, but they aren't poor either. Your father, Wu Shihuo, is a timber merchant and minor official. He's got enough money for silk slippers, but still yells at workers in the courtyard. Your mother doesn't smile much. She knows girls don't win history books. Still, you are lucky. You're given the rare privilege of education. Most girls your age are learning how to embroider phoenixes into pillowcases. You, however, are flipping through Confucian texts, squinting at ink that smells like soot and crushed orchids. You learn to write with a bamboo brush too big for your hands. And because your hands are small, you learn precision. Historians still argue whether Wu's early education was extraordinary or just tolerated because her father had no sons. But what's certain is this: you're a sponge. Not just for words, but for the way people move, speak, and bow differently depending on who's in the room. You notice which servant dares speak plainly, and which noble stares too long at his wine. You are quiet but not timid. When visitors arrive, you watch more than you talk. One day, a regional inspector half drunk on plum wine tells your father that your beauty could rival the imperial concubines. Your father laughs, but you feel the air shift. The Tang dynasty is flourishing. Poetry fills the courts. Scholars debate under lantern light. Silk flows from the capital to Persia, and the empire pulses with art trade and very polite executions. But women still rank below cattle in most inheritance scrolls. It's not just metaphor, it's sometimes literal. You learn that if you smile too much, people call you frivolous. If you speak too much, they call you insolent. So you do neither. You observe, you memorize, you wait. By the time you're 13, your mother tells you to start sleeping with your hair in curls. In case the emperor calls. She jokes, but there's a flicker of truth in her voice. The court starts requesting new concubines. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. It means being sent to the capital, entering a gilded cage full of whispers, perfumes, and silk sleeves hiding poison. And yet, it's a path. A risky, winding one, but it leads somewhere higher than any girl from Lizhu could dream of. And one morning, as the sun rises over the tiled rooftops and the scent of steamed buns fills the street, a letter arrives. The Emperor Taizong has summoned you. Not by name, he doesn't know it yet. Just a request. Send the girl. You don't cry. You nod, wrap your books in a cloth, and begin to pack. You're 14. You're about to disappear into history. But not the way anyone expects. You sit on a stiff wooden bench inside the carriage, watching the countryside blur by like ink spilling across rice paper. The ride to the capital isn't poetic, it's bumpy, dusty, and smells strongly of horse's garlic and a hint of nerves. You're surrounded by other girls, all hand-picked for their delicate features and appropriate obedience. None of them are reading. You are. The scroll in your lap is creased from rereading. It's a treatise on governance by Confucius, dense, moralistic, and not exactly light reading for someone about to enter a harem. But it's not about the words anymore. It's about focus. You train your mind not to drift, not to wonder what the palace smells like, or whether the emperor will notice you. You already know the answer, he probably won't. Chang'an, the capital, is overwhelming. It's a glittering bowl of palaces, gardens, and courtiers who seem to glide instead of walk. The gates are massive. The guards don't look at you, they look through you. You arrive not as Wu Zhao, a clever girl with sharp eyes and sharper memory, but as just another addition to the imperial harem, specifically the 5th rank of concubine, a glorified decoration. The palace smells like sandalwood and bureaucracy. You are shown to your quarters, which are beautiful but intentionally cold. The walls are decorated with calligraphy and floral murals. The floor is heated with tiles warmed from beneath. Your bed has silk sheets but no softness. You spend your first few weeks learning how to bow correctly. Yes, there's a wrong way to bow. Too fast and you're insincere. Too slow and you're arrogant. The other girls whisper constantly. You don't. You're watching the servants, not the courtesans. Because the servants know everything, where the emperor eats, who he favors, and which advisors are losing their hair from stress. The Emperor Taizong is older than your father. He has 40 concubines and the energy of someone who'd rather be fighting wars than reviewing petitions. When you finally meet him, it's brief. He asks your name, comments on your unusual confidence, then moves on. That's it. You're dismissed with a nod and a wave, like a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the room. You return to your quarters not disappointed but recalibrated. Here's the secret nobody tells you about palace life. It's less like a romance novel and more like a particularly decorative office job with frequent gossip and occasional threats of exile. You spend most days embroidering, pretending to embroider, or watching others embroider. You're still reading, mostly in secret. You start copying poems and notes, keeping them tucked under your mattress like a smuggled soul. Historians still debate whether Wu was close to Emperor Taizong during his lifetime. Some records suggest she was a minor companion. Others say she served as a secretary, transcribing court records, an unusual position for a woman, and one she likely earned through sheer force of competence. One story claims she once corrected a minister's punctuation mid-document, causing him to storm out in a rage. You can imagine it, the girl with the brush, quietly fixing a scholar's syntax while he fumes. You start recognizing patterns. Which ministers leave meetings looking confident, which eunuchs disappear for hours, which concubines spend too much time trying to be noticed. You don't try to stand out, you try to be indispensable. You even begin to make the occasional joke, quiet ones. Just enough to make a servant chuckle or an older concubine raise an eyebrow. A girl who can make people laugh without being seen as foolish, that's rarer than jade. Still, your status never changes. You are just one among many. You are not summoned often. You do not bear a child. And when the emperor falls ill, coughing fits that sound like thunder, wrapped in wet cloth, you know your time here is nearly over. Custom dictates that when an emperor dies, his concubines without children are sent to Buddhist convents. Not to marry, not to live, just to vanish. And so at the age of 24, you take vows you do not believe in, shave your head, and exchange your silk robes for ash-colored linen. They send you to Ganyu Temple. It's quiet, cold, full of the echoes of forgotten women. The nuns are kind but distant. Your hands are no longer ink-stained, they're calloused from grinding millet and hauling water. You still have your mind, though, and that is no small thing. There are moments when you feel forgotten, but you aren't, because miles away on a very different kind of cushion, the new Emperor Gaozong Taizong's son is thinking of you. You once served his father, you once met his gaze across the garden briefly, but enough to be remembered. And memory in the Tang court can be more powerful than bloodlines. One morning, a courier arrives at the temple. He brings tea and a question. Would you return? You don't answer right away. The tea is still warm, wrapped in silk, and tucked into a lacquered box. It smells faintly of jasmine and something older memory, maybe. You stare at it, then at the courier, then at your own hands. The nails are clean but rough. You've spent months pretending not to remember what court life felt like. Now here it is, steeping in front of you. The courier bows and waits. No scroll, no official summons. Just tea and a single message whispered politely through pursed lips. The Emperor remembers. Historians still debate the exact details of your return. Some claim it was orchestrated by Empress Wang herself, perhaps hoping to distract the Emperor from another rival consort Xiao. Others argue Gaozong remembered you on his own from the days you scribbled in his father's study and corrected minor mistakes without making a scene. Regardless of how it happened, one thing is clear: you are not dragged back. You are invited, and so you go. The nuns don't stop you. They've seen it before, courtly whims dressed as fate. You pack what little a comb, a scroll of poetry, and the sharp edge of patience honed into a weapon. Chang'an hasn't changed, but you have. You no longer look like a girl trying to be elegant. You look like a woman who knows how to disappear, and just as importantly, how to return. Gaozong is pleased to see you. He is not like his father. Softer around the edges, prone to headaches and indecision. He leans on advisors the way a child leans on banisters, nervously, then all at once. He doesn't just want a companion. He wants someone who can think. You give him that. You are reinstalled as a concubine, but this time you're not forgotten. He visits often, talks with you, laughs. You begin to edit his documents, not officially of course, but your handwriting begins to appear in the margins of policy scrolls. You suggest temple restorations, leniencies for drought-stricken provinces, and reforms that make eunuchs visibly nervous. Still, the palace is not a haven, it's a chessboard. And both Empress Wang and consort Xiao rivals for influence and affection begin to circle you with smiles that are slightly too wide. You learn quickly that affection alone is not power. You need an anchor, something permanent. And so you do what countless women before you could not. You bear the emperor a child, a son, then another. And now you're not just a former nun with a clever tongue. You're the mother of imperial heirs. This shifts everything. Your rank rises, your rooms become warmer. The whispers about your time in the convent are replaced by newer, sharper ones about your influence. Servants begin bowing lower. Ministers begin watching more closely. You're no longer a decoration. You're a presence. Gaozong grows more dependent on you. He begins delegating more decisions to your judgment. He defends you in court, and though he never formally crowns you empress yet, it's becoming increasingly clear you are not going anywhere. The Empress Wang is furious, but she's careful. She doesn't accuse you outright. She stages tea ceremonies with forced grace. She donates to temples and walks barefoot across palace stones in prayer for the emperor's health. But she's losing, and you're not winning by chance. One evening during a minor palace banquet, you manage to quote 3 ancient texts, refute a senior minister's policy suggestion, and comfort a nervous servant, all before dessert. The minister later resigns. The servant stays loyal for the next 2 decades. People are beginning to whisper your name, but no longer as a concubine. Wu Zhao, the woman who came back from exile, the one who reads, remembers, and replies with perfect timing. There is, however, a problem. Your rise is too smooth, too rational, and court life, like gravity, resists straight lines. One day, a scandal begins to ripple through the inner palace. A child, your own infant daughter, has died. The timing is suspicious. You had just begun to press for Empress Wang's dismissal. And now, whispers suggest the Empress herself may have had a hand in the child's death. There's no evidence, just glances and tears, and a servant who saw something, or imagined she did. Historians still argue whether you orchestrated the accusation or whether Wang truly was involved. Some claim you planted the rumor. Others argue it was palace politics combusting on their own. What matters is this: the emperor believes you. He dismisses Empress Wang. He exiles consort Xiao. And in one sweeping moment you become Empress Wu. You've done it. Not by charm, not by flattery, but by being impossible to remove. The palace bells ring, the court bows. And you, Wu Zhao, who once served in silence and lived behind temple walls, now sit beside the emperor of the Tang dynasty. Your hair is coiled like a serpent. Your robes are crimson. Your voice is soft but unshakable. And for the first time, you wonder, what if beside the emperor isn't enough? There's a phrase floating through the palace corridors now, whispered by servants, muttered by scholars, nervously half-joked by eunuchs as they light incense or deliver scrolls. She writes everything down. And it's true. You Wuzhou Empress of the Tang dynasty have begun keeping records. Not just the official ones, those are for show, but private ones detailed and unflinching. You write what ministers say when they think no one's listening. You note who bows too shallow, who hesitates before speaking, who suddenly grows too polite. You still smile, of course. That quiet, slanted smile that unsettles people more than outright anger ever could. But behind it now lies an empire of observation. You remember how you got here by watching. And now that you're Empress, you watch harder. Gaozong, meanwhile, is growing weaker. His migraines worsen, his appetite shrinks. The court doctors prescribe powdered pearls and deer, antler shavings, but the only thing that seems to calm him is your voice. You begin attending meetings in his place, seated behind a silk screen. Your silhouette listens, your hand makes notes. Your advice is whispered to the emperor and then spoken by him as if it were his own. Historians call this the Cui Lian Tingjeng period, listening to politics from behind a curtain. But let's be honest, you're not just listening, you're ruling. Not publicly, not yet. But when decisions are made, they are your decisions. It begins with small things adjustments to tax policy, suggestions for improving grain storage. Then larger matters, military promotions, border negotiations, appointments of key officials. You suggest scholars who praise your governance. You remove those who hesitate to do so. The bureaucracy begins to shift slowly but unmistakably, like a great dragon stirring in its sleep. Still, you're careful. You attend Buddhist ceremonies. You donate to temples. You commission poetry extolling peace and filial piety. You uphold the rituals of Tang court life with meticulous grace. But you also ensure that, one by one, your enemies are removed from their positions. Gaozong doesn't seem to mind. Or perhaps he does, but by now he relies on you so completely that resistance feels like work, and work is not something he enjoys anymore. You begin printing copies of your favorite sutras, carefully edited versions, of course. Passages that emphasize the divine wisdom of female rulers, the harmony brought by maternal leadership. You make sure your name appears in the dedications, not as a mere patron, but as a force of moral order. Some monks quietly protest. Others embrace the new doctrine like a warm blanket. After all, the Empress is generous. The Empress is clever. The Empress is listening. You start building alliances with scholars and generals alike. Not by bribery, not even always by flattery. You give them something rarer, a sense of security. Under Wu Zhao, they know what to expect. You reward competence. You punish betrayal. You promote based on loyalty, but also on results. That's the real danger, isn't it? You're good at this. The Tang court was never meant to have a woman at the helm, not openly. But the more you govern, the more even your skeptics admit things are functioning. Revenue increases. Famines are addressed faster. Roads are repaired. Tribes on the northern frontier stop testing their luck so often. But not everyone is pleased. A clique of Confucian purists begins publishing pamphlets carefully worded, of course reminding the court that heaven ordains a strict hierarchy and women are best kept in the inner chambers. These tracts are anonymous. You pretend not to notice. But days later, several authors are quietly reassigned to distant provinces with terrible winters and worse cuisine. Historians still debate whether Wu personally ordered these reassignments. Some argue her advisors acted independently. Others claim she reviewed every personnel change down to the village postmaster. You do not clarify. Instead, you commission a new set of palace painting scenes from classical history, where wise women advise foolish kings. You ensure these artworks are placed along major corridors. Ministers must walk past them to reach the audience hall. You never comment on the images. You don't have to. Meanwhile, your sons are growing. Too fast. They squabble, compete, whisper things they think you don't hear. One of them, Li Hong, is bright, kind, and cautious. You begin grooming him as heir, allowing him to sit in on council meetings. The others glare. You keep notes. You don't trust easily, but you trust your own documentation. You develop a new filing system for court records, one so efficient that later dynasties will copy it. You oversee renovations of imperial offices, install better lighting, and request regular audits of treasury scrolls. Your palace isn't just decorated in silk and jade, it runs like a mechanism. One minister jokes that working under you is like being caught in a spider's web made of paper. You hear about it. He is soon invited to retire and does so quite eagerly. Gaozong continues to decline. He often naps through meetings now. Sometimes he forgets what day it is. Sometimes he signs things without reading them. You read everything. And sometimes you write things for him. It's not forgery if no one asks questions. One evening in the hush, between incense bells and moonrise, you look around the council chamber. Every official in the room has either been promoted by you, protected by you, or very much does not want to be reassigned to the snowy west. And you think maybe it's time. Not yet, but soon. Soon you will no longer rule from behind a screen. You will rule from the throne. It begins not with a proclamation, but with a headache. Gaozong has always been fragile, but lately he's almost translucent. The court physicians surround him with drying herbs, crushed antlers, rare mushrooms, and enough incense to smother an ox. He sits on the dragon throne like a ghost, trying to remember how to be human. You don't rush things. You let the court murmur. You let the ministers guess. You keep signing documents, on his behalf, of course. Just a helpful wife. Just making sure the empire doesn't fall apart while His Majesty naps through another foreign envoy's speech. The day he suggests you should issue edicts in your own name is the day your silk curtain disappears. Not physically. It's still there hanging across the inner palace. But symbolically, the curtain is gone. You no longer need shadows. You don't need borrowed authority. You are Wu Zhao, and your ink is now law. You issue your first formal orders as Heavenly Empress, a title that sounds a bit exaggerated until people realize you're not joking. The bureaucracy groans but obeys. The ministers grit their teeth but comply. And Gaozong he sighs with relief. He never liked governing anyway. Historians still argue whether Gaozong was complicit in his own eclipse. Some say he was too weak to fight you. Others believe he was relieved to hand the burden off to someone smarter, sharper, and far more awake. Either way, the result is the same: you rule, and you don't waste time. You begin auditing the treasury. You find errors in accounts managed by old families who assumed your lack of a beard meant you didn't understand math. You do. You streamline grain distribution to famine-struck provinces. You reduce punishments for minor crimes, institute agricultural reforms, and here's a fun one: you make it easier for women to accuse their husbands of abandonment. One minister faints. Another retires to meditate. You replace them both. Your court becomes a place of both fear and fascination. Eunuchs carry whispers like smoke. Officials begin memorizing your preferences, no excessive flattery, no long-winded reports, and never ever interrupt the Empress mid-scroll. You install a new bureaucracy of secret inspectors tasked with monitoring the local governors. These imperial reviewers don't wear uniforms. They don't announce themselves. They appear, ask questions, and vanish. One governor tries to bribe his inspector. He's soon reassigned to a border post known mostly for wolves and nothing else. But you're not just feared, you're efficient. Palace records begin to show faster resolution of disputes, increased tax compliance, and an odd but noticeable improvement in calligraphy across imperial memos because no one wants to send you an ugly scroll. You issue an edict requesting that all imperial children, including girls, be taught to read. Some advisors protest. You ask them if they'd like their own daughters to marry illiterate sons-in-law. That ends the debate. One scholar gifts you a poem comparing your reign to the steady rhythm of the Yellow River. You promote him. Another tries comparing you to a tigress in silk. He is given a one-way posting to a very damp province known for its leeches. And yet, even with your firm grip, you never forget the theater of power. You commission sculptures, paintings, and new imperial seals. You wear elaborate robes embroidered with dragons and phoenixes, creatures not typically assigned to women, but you decide they now are. You host elaborate ceremonies where you personally appear to oversee rites usually performed by emperors. The message is clear: you are not filling in. You are it. There's one moment, small, quiet, but telling, when a visiting official from Silla in what is now Korea bows and addresses you not as consort, not as regent, but as sacred majesty. You don't correct him, you thank him. And later that week, his trade permits are mysteriously approved in record time. Still, your position isn't officially supreme. Not yet. You've taken over the role. You've worn the robes. You've signed the edicts. But technically, the title of emperor still belongs to Gaozong, until the headaches stop. And by stop, we mean Gaozong stops entirely. He dies in 683 CE. The court mourns. There are official rituals. There are ceremonial weepings. But behind all that, the real ceremony is happening in scrollwork and silence. Ministers gather to discuss succession. Your sons squabble. Factions form. You stay calm. You've prepared for this. Your son Zhongzong is crowned emperor, briefly. Then he makes the classic mistake: he starts listening to his wife. And worse, he starts ignoring you. He tries to make appointments without consulting you. He tries to speak in audiences while you're still present. He even, brace yourself, signs an edict without asking your opinion first. That lasts about 6 weeks. You exile him. You replace him with his younger brother, Ruizong. He is quieter, more agreeable, and most importantly, completely under your control. Now, the truth is undeniable. You aren't the Empress Dowager in name only. You are the ruler. And as the dust settles over Chang'an, the ministers bow lower, the poets write faster, and the whispers get quieter. Because everyone knows what's coming. The throne has always had a man on it, but not for long. You don't just take the throne. You design it first, quite literally. You commission new regalia robes embroidered not just with dragons, but with blooming lotuses, heavenly clouds, and your own insignia. You redesign the official seal. You rename your reign. You sit upon the imperial dais, not as the Empress Dowager, not as a placeholder, but as Emperor Shengshen Huangdi, Holy and Divine Sovereign. It is the year 690 CE, and you, Wu Zhao, are now the only woman in Chinese history to officially take the title of emperor. You issue an edict: the Tang dynasty is over. Long live the Zhou dynasty. Yes, you borrow the name of China's ancient golden age. Bold move? Certainly. But it's not about originality, it's about symbolism. You're not replacing a dynasty. You're restoring something purer, older, more sacred. Historians still argue whether this move was about ego branding or legitimate religious conviction. Some say you saw yourself as a reincarnated sage ruler. Others say you were simply brilliant at marketing. Either way, your new dynasty has begun, and with it comes a flurry of reforms. You promote scholars who've been frozen out by Tang loyalists. You elevate capable officials from non-aristocratic backgrounds. You bring in women to serve in positions of literary and clerical power, a first in imperial China. You commission new history books to be written emphasizing the moral authority of the sovereign, especially when the sovereign happens to be you. You standardize punishments, simplify tax collection, and quietly remove corrupt judges. You also begin collecting jade from around the empire, not just for display, but as symbols of divine rule. You're not just ruling by law, you're ruling by cosmology. And if anyone complains, you send them to reflect in far-off provinces with wolves. You also begin reshaping the capital itself. New temples, new statues, new stelae carved with edicts proclaiming your virtue. You oversee the construction of a giant bronze Buddha taller than any built before. He sits in serene meditation, his eyes half-lidded like yours during council meetings. And of course, you continue to write edicts, poems, commentaries, letters. Your brush never sleeps. Some of your works survive to this day, elegant, philosophical, and not shy about reminding readers how wise their author is. A typical line might read, "Though I wear the garments of a woman, I bear the virtue of 10,000 kings." Subtle, not quite. Effective, absolutely. Still, opposition simmers. Some Tang loyalists begin calling your reign illegitimate behind closed doors. They say you have broken heaven's mandate, that you've disrupted the natural order, that the empire will fall under a woman's hand. You respond by, doubling down on paperwork. You open official channels for public complaints, a radical move. You install bronze boxes across the empire where citizens can anonymously report corrupt officials. You personally raid many of them, some are petty. Others lead to arrests. One governor is removed for hoarding rice, another for taking bribes. A few are caught gossiping about your poetry. Their fates are educational. You create a meritocracy that begins to chip away at aristocratic privilege. You elevate men and women based on talent and not birth. This terrifies the old guard and endears you to everyone else. You are popular in the countryside among farmers and merchants who've never seen a throne but know a fair ruler when they see one. They carve your name into wooden charms. They burn incense in your honor. They name their daughters Zhao. And yet you are not naive. You build a network of informants so vast it's said that not even the palace cats could scratch the floor without someone reporting it. Spycraft becomes a bureaucratic art. You cross-reference reports. You reward silence with comfort and betrayal with cold exile. Still, you are careful not to rule by fear alone. You host public audiences, allowing commoners to present petitions in person. You kneel to no one, but you listen. You introduce reforms to reduce the burden of military service on peasants. You provide grain relief during floods. You even oversee a series of imperial examinations meant to find talent from the lowest classes. Some of the scholars promoted during your reign will go on to shape China for centuries. But power, no matter how divine, is never stable. You begin to sense restlessness even among your sons. Yes, they've returned. Yes, they bow. But the bows are slower now, heavier. One of them, Zhongzong, the same you once deposed, begins smiling a little too often during court sessions. He asks questions about succession. He lingers when reading military appointments. You pretend not to notice, but you do. You increase your guards. You rotate your attendants more frequently. You send Zhongzong on a ceremonial pilgrimage to a distant temple for reflection, you say. He reflects for 6 months. Meanwhile, the Zhou dynasty flourishes. Trade routes expand. Crime drops. Literacy rises. And yet, you are still treated by many as an intermission in history, a parenthesis rather than a chapter. You plan to change that. You commission a massive stone stilly blank. Yes, completely blank. It's placed near your future tomb, a smooth monument with no inscription. Scholars still puzzle over it today. Some say it's a symbol of modesty. Others say you knew history would write what it wanted anyway, so you left it a mirror instead of a message. And perhaps deep down you understood something even emperors rarely grasp. That silence properly placed can echo longer than words. There is a sound in the palace now. It's not the clack of court shoes or the hush of silks brushing the floor. It's quieter than that, more persistent. Whispers. They're not loud enough to call rebellion. Not bold enough to be sedition. But they're there like the rustling of bamboo just before a storm. Ministers lean too close during meetings. Eunuchs suddenly pause when you enter a corridor. Your name, once uttered with reverent certainty, is now spoken with a touch more caution. Or not at all. You know what it is. You've ruled too long, too effectively, too alone, and your son's once quiet shadows in your grand choreography are beginning to form into something else. Figures. Ambitions. Li San, your third son, and briefly your heir, is now confined to his residence after being encouraged to reflect on his writings which curiously expressed support for Confucian order and the restoration of proper dynastic succession. You suspect a certain senior scholar helped him draft those lines. That scholar is now teaching poetry in a very quiet mountain town. Zhongzong, the one with the smile that's a little too round, is back in court. This time he is being careful. He praises you publicly, bows deeply, and always asks your opinion before speaking. But underneath you can feel it. That flicker. That pull of dynasty. Of men who believe that rule should pass like a family sword from father to son, not mother to nobody. Historians still argue whether you grew more ruthless during this phase. Some say the pressure made you paranoid. Others insist you were simply tightening the weave of a net you'd always intended to close. Either way, your tools sharpen. You establish a secret inquiry office, a formal institution, within the bureaucracy designed to monitor treason, sedition, and morally dangerous thoughts. It sounds dramatic, but the effect is subtle. A magistrate says the wrong thing in a tavern, he disappears. A bureaucrat delays a reform order, his property is seized. A cousin complains about your latest tax law, he's suddenly reassigned to meditate in a cave. Justice, control, self-preservation, all of the above. And yet even amid the tightening grip, your court runs well. Too well, in fact. Poets flourish, scholars publish, silk and grain shipments increase. Crime in the capital drops to near legendary levels. Your spy network is so efficient that one foreign envoy jokes, "The Empress probably knew I was arriving before I did." You smile when you hear that. He's not wrong. But then something unexpected. Your own court poet turns against you. His name is Shen Quanqi and he's good. Too good. His verses begin hinting at lost balance, at the weight of lotus shadows over ancient altars. They're subtle, artful, dangerous. You do not exile him. You promote him, and then quietly commission your own counterpoems. Shorter, sweeter, easier to memorize. Because you understand something essential: power is not just law. Power is narrative. So you write. You have texts engraved in stone. You distribute new sutras to temples, subtly reinforcing your moral authority. You ensure your name appears in the colophon of every major work printed in the capital. One official proposes a national archive. You approve it on the condition that it include a women worth emulating section. You personally write half the entries. One such entry includes a description of a wise ruler who bears the burden of state while cloaked in humility. A veiled self-portrait perhaps, but veils are your specialty. Still something in you begins to shift. You're aging. You feel it first in the mornings, your joints ache. Your eyes blur slightly when reading scrolls at night. You dismiss the court physicians when they mention it, but in private, you know. The clock has not stopped even for you, so you begin to think about legacy and then tragedy. A palace maid is found weeping in a courtyard. She claims she overheard a plot. Something involving one of your sons, an old general, and a jeweled hairpin. The specifics are vague, but the message is clear. You act swiftly. That evening, the palace is silent, except for the shuffle of guards repositioning. Your son Li Dan is called to your quarters. You do not scold. You do not accuse. You serve him tea and ask a single question: is your heart still your own? He nods. You nod back. Later that week, he is quietly moved to a separate palace, ostensibly for his health. Historians still debate what the hairpin plot really was. Some say it was invented. Others say it was real, but never meant to succeed. Some even argue it was your way of testing loyalties, a stage play, written in shadows and performed for no audience. Whatever the truth, the effect is clear. The court tightens. The sons retreat. The ministers bow lower than ever, and you now firmly in your 70s pause, not to rest, but to watch. You have no illusions. You've built something unprecedented. But you know empires are not eternal, especially empires forged by women in a world of men. So you write again. A new edict, a few final poems, a handful of quiet reforms that will, you hope, last longer than you do. And then in the quiet of your study, you whisper a thought that only the paper will hear. Let them call me ruthless, but let them spell my name correctly. The lamps in your study flicker with the weight of age, or maybe it's just the oil running low. Either way, you feel it, the soft unraveling. Not of your mind, which remains sharp as a lacquered pin, but of your body, your legacy, the court around you. The sons you have groomed, exiled, reinstated, and watched like chess pieces are no longer boys. They've grown into men with ambitions behind their smiles. Courtiers who once quaked under your gaze now exchange glances in your presence. The guards bow just as low, but the silence afterward lasts a beat too long. You are in your late 70s now, and for a ruler in the 7th century, that's not just rare, it's suspicious. People start whispering about whether heaven still favors your reign. The clouds haven't moved quite right lately. A minor eclipse is interpreted as a celestial eyebrow raise. Even your favored parrot, once cheerful, has grown quiet. Bad omen, or just old age, you don't ask. You've never needed omens to read people. You've outlived enemies, rewritten rituals, and replaced the imperial calendar itself. But time isn't something you can draft a decree against, so you begin preparing the palace for a transition. You do it gently, strategically. You know what happens when transitions feel like weakness. You recall Zhongzong from his comfortable retreat, not as a prince, but as a guest. He returns with wide eyes, a careful tone, and an entourage of wives and in-laws that smell faintly of ambition and cinnamon oil. You keep him close. You observe. He is not the boy you exiled. He is careful now, thoughtful, slightly boring, but in a way that reassures the nervous bureaucrats still clinging to Confucian ideals. And you wonder, can he handle this? Can he hold it together when you're gone? Historians still argue whether you truly intended to pass the throne back to your son, or whether you were simply testing how close he'd creep to it before trying to snatch it. Either way, the decision becomes less theoretical with each passing month. You begin to suffer from bouts of illness. Not dramatic, not fatal yet, but draining. Your voice weakens. You start dictating instead of writing. You rest more often wrapped in layers of soft silk with fire pits glowing nearby. Your bedchamber, once an engine of planning and whisper campaigns, becomes quieter. You still receive reports, but fewer. The gears of your government are turning without your constant touch now, exactly as you designed it. But it feels strange. Like watching a brush you set down continue painting on its own. It is during one of these resting periods that Zhang Yiji and Zhang Changzong enter the picture. Brothers. Beautiful, well-mannered, artistic, and utterly devoted to your comfort. They read to you. They mix your medicines. They keep your moods lifted with poetry, massage, and gentle flattery. The court is scandalized. Two male favorites attending the emperor's chamber, handpicked by the empress herself. Oh, the whispers are deafening. You do not care. You are tired. And these boys, yes, they're boys in every way that matters, bring you small joys. A few songs, a new perfume, a perfectly steeped cup of chrysanthemum tea. Let them whisper. You've outlived far worse. But some do more than whisper. A clique of Tang loyalist ministers who have been waiting, simmering quietly, praying to the old dynasty, begin pushing harder. They visit Zhongzong's residence more often. They encourage him to ease the empress's burden. They suggest that perhaps heaven is calling for restoration, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Zhang brothers should go. You begin to feel your grip weakening not just physically, but structurally. The institutions you built remain strong, but the loyalty you commanded is now fragile, conditional. One evening you wake to find your chamber unusually quiet. No attendants, no incense, just the soft creak of floorboards, and a question forming in your mind, not spoken, just gently floating above you. Is it time? You don't answer. There's no one to hear it anyway. But by the end of the week, your decision is clear. You summon Zhongzong. You speak in short, clipped sentences. You instruct him to resume duties. You tell him not ask that he will inherit the throne again. You do not smile. You do not touch his hand. You simply nod. And with that, you abdicate. Formally, publicly, it is the year 705 CE. You have ruled directly for 15 years and indirectly for nearly 4 decades. The news spreads like warm ink across silk. The empress has stepped down. Zhongzong ascends for the second time. The Zhang brothers are dismissed. You retire to the Shangyang Palace. It is beautiful, quiet. The ceilings are painted with constellations. The floor is warm stone. Servants speak in low tones. There is tea every morning and poetry in the afternoon, but you do not write anymore. Your hands are tired. Your thoughts drift. Sometimes when the sun angles just right through the lattice, you see your old self reflected in the polished floor, barefoot, a book tucked under your arm, walking quietly behind your father's office. A girl no one thought would matter. And now, a dynasty bears your name. You do not fade quietly, even in retirement, even in your final months at Shangyang Palace. Your presence lingers like the scent of powdered sandalwood in silk cushions. The courtiers know it. The guards know it. Zhongzong knows it. Officially, he is emperor now. But every time he signs an edict, he hesitates just a little, as if wondering whether you'd have approved it, whether the calligraphy looks right, whether the policy will hold up under the weight of your memory. You've left him a government more efficient than any he's likely to manage on his own. But you don't gloat. You watch. From your quiet wing of the palace, wrapped in soft brocade, and drifting through dreams that sometimes blur with memory, you still receive updates. Visitors come and go. Ministers offer perfunctory bows. Even your old detractors do so, if only to say they once stood in the presence of the woman who rewrote an empire. Zhangzong, bless him, tries to assert himself. He reverses a few of your edicts. Not dramatically, he's no fool, but enough to send a message. He reinstates a few court traditions you had abolished. He reshuffles his advisory council. He promotes some of the Confucian purists who had kept their heads down during your reign. Their sleeves are wider, their sermons longer. You sigh. Not in anger, in boredom. You've heard this song before. Historians still debate whether Zhongzong resented you or feared you more. Some suggest he was grateful that he understood his reign was only possible because you'd cleared the path of traitors and incompetence. Others believe he chafed under your shadow, desperate to prove he wasn't merely your puppet. Both can be true. Still, he rules cautiously, for now, and the people haven't forgotten. Merchants still carry your image on small wooden charms. Mothers still tell their daughters about the woman who rose from a convent and sat on the dragon throne. Farmers tired of war and taxes still mutter your name, in gratitude for those grain reforms from 20 years ago. You are not loved by all, but you are remembered, and that is something deeper. One afternoon, a courier brings you a gift from a distant province. A single carved stone tablet engraved with your personal motto. It reads simply, "Order before appearance." You laugh softly. It's not bad. A bit dull perhaps, but fitting. You were never interested in pageantry for its own sake. Even your grandest ceremonies were strategic. Your robes were armor, your silences were weapons. You spend long hours on your veranda, now watching the garden change with the seasons. The chrysanthemums bloom, the bamboo rattles the koi, ripple beneath stone bridges that you had designed yourself. Your world grows smaller, but your influence stretches outward, still etched into the very bones of the bureaucracy like the watermark beneath fine paper. And then the day arrives. It is quiet, gentle, no thunderclap, no rebellion. Just the final fluttering page of a very long scroll. You fall ill not dramatically, just a slow unraveling. The physicians offer tonics and prayers. The attendants hold your hand. A few loyal ministers even visit, bowing low, their eyes never quite meeting yours. You say little. There is nothing left to prove. The court arranges a mourning period in advance, anticipating the inevitable. Zhangzong issues proclamations of reverence, declares his immeasurable gratitude, and orders the preparation of your tomb, though it had already been started decades earlier under your own supervision. Of course it had. You've always planned ahead. The mausoleum is located at the base of the Liangshan Mountains. Stone lions guard the path. The walls are lined with carved scripts and symbols of your reign. And at the entrance stands the most curious monument, a blank stele. Yes, still blank. Visitors marvel at it. Scholars argue about it. Some say it reflects humility. Others say it dares history to speak in your place. One daring official even calls it a challenge. Let those who follow write what they dare. You would have liked that one. On the final morning, you sit upright. Just once. You reach for a brush, but do not write. You hold it like memory, then set it down. The sunlight falls across your lap in a soft patch of gold. The garden rustles. The parrot, yes, the old one croaks. Something incoherent and oddly comforting. And then you close your eyes, just for a moment, just long enough. Wu Zhao, the only woman to sit as emperor in China, passes quietly. Not in war, not in exile, but in peace, surrounded by the very world she shaped. No last words, just silence, and a stele that still waits. Your passing does not go unnoticed. No one dares speak loudly in the court that morning. Even the clattering of breakfast trays feels too harsh, too alive. Zhangzong declares a national mourning period. Officials wear plain robes. Drums are silenced. Bells toll low and slow like a heartbeat winding down. The Imperial Gazette prints your posthumous title, an impossibly long string of virtues. Martial, sagely benevolent, filial divine, and wise empress. A mouthful of silk, really. you'd probably have rolled your eyes, but you would have appreciated the ceremony. Zhangzong walks behind your coffin in full mourning garb. Ministers sob theatrically as they are trained to do. Eunuchs wail with professional commitment. The people line the roads watching as your funeral procession snakes toward the mausoleum you began planning before most of them were born. And behind the tears, behind the incense and chants, something more subtle happens. The myths begin. It doesn't take long. Within weeks, rumors ripple through villages and tea stalls. Some say your spirit rides a dragon now circling the imperial city during thunderstorms. Others whisper you were a goddess all along, descended in mortal form to test the resilience of men. A farmer carves your face onto a charm and places it on his ox's harness for a good harvest, he explains. A midwife begins whispering your name during difficult births. A traveling monk claims to have seen your face in a cloud over Mount Tai. Historians meanwhile scramble. Some try to erase you, others overcorrect. The Confucian scholars especially are deeply uncomfortable. A woman on the throne with spies and reforms and poetry. It doesn't fit the model. So they do what scholars often do when confused, they argue. Was she a tyrant or a visionary? Did she rivals or merely remove them? Did she manipulate religion or truly believe she was a bodhisattva ruler? The truth, of course, floats somewhere in between. Like the lotus you once had embroidered into your imperial seal, rooted in the mud, but blooming above it. Some records are burned, others are carefully edited. But a few scribes, perhaps with a quiet fondness for women who don't follow rules, tuck your name into footnotes and margins. They preserve fragments of your poetry, anecdotes, eyewitness lines. One writes, "She ruled as a man might, but with the eyes of a mother." That one stays. Meanwhile, the empire begins to shift. Zhangzong takes the throne fully. He's more decorative than decisive, more ceremonial than strategic. He reinstates a few nobles you had dismissed. He reverses a handful of your reforms. Nothing dramatic at first, but soon the old families begin returning. Whispers turn into factions. Your spy network, still half intact, records it all. Too late to stop it, but not too late to remember. Within a few years, the palace is no longer run by your system of rotating auditors and silent informants. It returns to favoritism bribes and old bloodlines reshuffling into power. One of your grandsons tries to restore your reforms. He's demoted. A Tang loyalist writes a denunciation of your reign filled with flowery warnings about unnatural order and feminine chaos. It's copied by a dozen academies, and yet, even as your name becomes controversial, your example becomes inevitable. Women across China, especially those with education, begin citing your legacy. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. A few empresses in later dynasties reference your writings in private letters. A Song dynasty teacher encourages her daughters to read your decrees. By the Ming era, your story is already legend dramatized in puppet theater and shadow plays. Always a bit exaggerated, always a bit dangerous, but always there, because you changed the rules. You didn't just rise through the system, you rewrote it. You didn't beg for power, you took it. You didn't ask permission, you gave orders. And whether they loved you or feared you, no one could look away. Even today, your legacy pulses faintly beneath every account of China's imperial past. A current just under the surface. A line of ink that refuses to fade no matter how many scrolls try to blot it out. You are not a footnote. You are the asterisk. The exception that became the example. You're gone, but the palace hasn't forgotten how to tremble. Zhangzong rules in your place now, but no one quite believes it. Every policy he issues is compared quietly, sometimes bitterly, to what you would have done. Every edict is held up to the light, like old silk searching for signs of your threads woven beneath. And in his attempt to step out from your shadow, he does what many men do when overwhelmed by legacy. He listens to everyone but himself, especially his wife. Empress Wu is sharp, ambitious, and not nearly as subtle as you were. She dresses in your colors. She mimics your reforms badly. She even tries to position her own daughter as heir, echoing the very playbook you wrote, but skipping the nuance. It's almost flattering. Almost. Meanwhile, the ministers shift uneasily in their robes. Some were elevated under you, and now live in quiet tension, unsure whether to speak your name or pretend you were a passing cloud. Others, newly returned from exile or retirement, gleefully erase your portraits from government halls and revise archives to soften your reign. But it doesn't quite work, because your fingerprints are everywhere. The bureaucracy you reshaped still hums along. The exam systems, the rural tax records, the water management scrolls, these weren't ideologies. They were instructions. And even the ministers trying to undo your influence still rely on your policies to keep the empire from tripping over its own ceremonial robes. You knew this would happen. You expected it. In fact, you planned for it. Remember the blank stele. It starts drawing crowds. Pilgrims, historians, curious farmers. They stand before it and whisper stories. Some true, some wildly fictional. But every one of them's a refusal to forget. One popular tale has you disguising yourself as a maid to spy on foreign diplomats. Another claims you once composed an imperial decree in verse and made a corrupt governor weep from shame. None of it is confirmed. All of it is believed. The stele becomes not just a monument, but a mirror. People project onto it what they want to believe about you, the tyrant, the poet, the reformer, the dragon in silk. Historians still argue about your reign. That hasn't changed, but the tone has. You're no longer described as a disruption, you're a phenomenon. A later Tang scholar writes, she ruled without permission and the sky did not fall. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, girls learn your name. Not as scandal, but as possibility. In markets, old women mutter advice with your name pinned at the end like, punctuation, study hard Wu Zetian. Read books before breakfast. A new generation of female poets emerge in the 8th century. Some cite you directly in their work. One writes, I write in silence, as she once ruled. And yet inside the palace trouble brews. Empress Wu grows more confident, too confident. She begins making decisions without Zhongzong. She forges edicts. She moves her allies into key positions. She promotes her daughter, Princess Anli, as a future sovereign, an echo of your boldest move, but without the preparation or the power to back it up. Zhongzong, perhaps sensing history repeating itself, dies suddenly. The official cause, a heart attack. The unofficial rumor, poison tea. Historians still argue whether Empress Wu orchestrated his death. Some claim she was desperate to secure power for herself and Anli. Others think Zhongzong was simply too weak to survive the storm his mother once navigated with grace. In any case, chaos returns. The court fractures again. Loyalists, opportunists, former allies of yours, each scrambling to fill the vacuum. Empress Wu attempts to claim the regency. Princess Anli makes her bid. And then the blow comes. Your grandson Li Longji rises. With the support of loyal generals and a decisive strike, he overthrows Empress Wu, executes her, and restores order. He is firm, efficient, and careful to name you not her as the true architect of strong imperial rule. He becomes Emperor Xuanzong. Under him, the Tang dynasty enters a new golden age, culturally vibrant, administratively strong, and quietly built on the reforms you left behind. He does not erase you. He learns from you. And in doing so, he ensures that your legacy survives, not just as a cautionary tale, but as precedent. Because once the impossible happens, once a woman rules an empire, the idea never quite disappears again. It becomes history. It becomes memory. It becomes permission. You're no longer here, and yet your name continues to echo in places your feet never touched. In a dusty village temple 2 provinces away, a priest finishes a ritual prayer with an unusual flourish, a line of verse from one of your poems. He says it brings better luck in harvest years. In a girls' school outside Luoyang, the teacher has no formal approval to teach political history, but she reads aloud stories of a woman who once ruled the empire. She doesn't say your name. She doesn't have to. The girls lean closer anyway. In the court, they are less subtle. Your portrait, formerly hidden, then restored, then moved depending on the politics of the hour, now hangs again in the Hall of Worthy Rulers. Slightly off-center, yes, and a bit smaller than others. But it's there. There's talk of you again in the bureaucracy, not just in whispers, but in documents. Tang Dynasty law codes still reflect the reforms you introduced. Your changes to land allocation and tax structure remain in place. Your bureaucratic inspection systems so efficient they made governors sweat just thinking about them are still being copied century after century. And the idea that a woman could wield that much power, still scandalous, still inspiring, depends on who you ask. Scholars argue across the ages. One in the Song dynasty praises your intelligence but condemns your ambition. Another in the Yuan dynasty calls your reign divinely structured but questions your feminine overreach. You'd probably laugh at that. The Ming dynasty tries to ignore you. The Qing dynasty can't. By the 17th century, you've become something else entirely: a symbol, a metaphor, a lesson in every direction. For some, you're the nightmare proof that when women rule, empires quake. For others, you're the dream proof that when women rule, empires work. And for many more, you're the question itself. What if a woman could rule without hiding behind curtains? What if merit outshone lineage? What if poetry and policy weren't opposites? What if the emperor didn't need a beard? Centuries roll on. Your stele remains blank. Rain wears down the edges. Moss creeps up the base. But no one dares carve into it. It's not just a stone. It's a challenge. Even in its emptiness, it speaks louder than any inscription ever could. One legend says that during a summer storm, lightning struck the stone and left behind a faint outline resembling your face. The local monks deny it. The tourists insist. Someone even sketches it into a prayer scroll. No one agrees. Everyone tells the story anyway, because you're no longer just a figure. You are folklore now. Your story becomes opera lavish, painted dramatic. You're played by actresses in crimson robes, their voices soaring across bamboo stages under paper lanterns. In one version, you tame tigers with your voice. In another, you rise to heaven, riding a golden phoenix. In all of them, you outwit every man in the room. And the truth lies somewhere beneath all that makeup and myth. It lies in the letters you wrote, in the edicts signed in your name, in the people who remembered what you did even when they forgot who you were, and in the policies still read in bureaucrat training sessions 200 years later. Even the court scribes tasked with maintaining imperial neutrality have trouble ignoring the sheer volume of your contributions. They tally the temples you built, the civil projects. You initiated the criminals, you pardoned the scholars, you appointed the verses you penned. And they mutter under their breath that it would take a very large footnote to erase you now. A few try anyway. One writes, though she ruled, she was still only a woman. Another quietly replies in the margins, yet still she ruled. You're still being watched centuries later. Not with fear, necessarily, but with fascination. The imperial historians, those careful curators of posthumous reputation, struggle to define you without unraveling their entire framework. You don't fit the categories. You were both ruthless and reforming, poetic and punitive, loyal and calculating. You were the contradiction that held itself together so tightly no one dared question the stitching until long after you were gone. And even now when they do, the threads refuse to come undone. It's the late Tang era and a new emperor sits the throne. He commissions a revised history of your reign. The scholars gather scrolls piled like small hills around them. Some want to downplay your accomplishments. Others insist that doing so would make the entire dynasty look ridiculous after all. What kind of empire lets itself be ruled for decades by a woman and then claims she didn't matter? The final compromise, you're portrayed as capable but unnatural. The phrase they use is aberration of heaven's will. Still, the record is kept. Meanwhile, outside the capital, something else is happening. Quiet, personal, and impossible to legislate. Women are writing, not officially, not yet, but letters, essays, poems, little ripples of ink across silk. Some of them cite you indirectly. Others quote your verses word for word, disguised as anonymous proverbs. One writes, if she could rule, I can at least speak. And speak they do. In court memoirs, novels, plays, and folk songs, you become not just a character, but an archetype. The clever maiden, the imperial mother, the wronged concubine who turns her exile into an empire, the phoenix rising from a convent's ashes. By the time the Song dynasty arrives, you're part of the curriculum, if only as a cautionary tale. But students remember you. They debate you. They copy your edicts as handwriting exercises, tracing your strokes, letter by letter. One records in the margins, her brush is heavier than a sword. The phrase spreads, centuries pass. You are no longer feared. You are dissected, unpacked. footnoted in dozens of languages. A few Jesuit missionaries upon arriving in China are shocked to hear about you. A female emperor? Preposterous. Their letters home sound half disbelieving, half admiring. Madame Wu they call you. And back in Chang'an now, Xi'an, the bones of your reign remain. The great wild goose pagoda rebuilt under your patronage still stands. The roads you ordered paved still connect villages to rivers, market towns to temples. Even the steely road leading to your blank monument is lined with stones that remember your titles, your dates, your dynasty. The blank one stands tallest. Later during the Ming, someone tries to add a line. Just one. A stonecutter chisels first and only female emperor into the lower right corner. He is arrested. The stone is cleaned. The space left blank again. It becomes a tradition. Every few decades, someone tries to write your story onto the stone. Every time it's removed, as if even history agrees, your silence says more. But still, you're not silent everywhere. In the Qing dynasty, a scholar finds one of your poems in a temple archive. He publishes it in a collection. Readers are surprised it's good. Really good. Elegant, sparse, haunting. The wind carries no name, yet bends every branch. They copy it onto fans, ink it onto scrolls, paint it beneath images of moonlit plum trees. Suddenly, Wu Zetian the emperor becomes Wu Zetian the poet once more, and that too spreads, not in conquest, not in policy, but in art. You are no longer just remembered, you are interpreted. Paintings, operas, shadow plays, and eventually, when the time is right, films. One director casts you as a tragic heroine, another as a shrewd politician with a soft spot for orphans. A third imagines you secretly disguising yourself as a man to infiltrate enemy ranks. All nonsense, all powerful, because your legacy now belongs to imagination as much as to fact. And somewhere in the quiet corners of libraries and late-night history debates, the question still floats. If Wu Zetian ruled today, what would she do? And the real question whispered beneath it, why does she still feel so modern? Let's pause for a moment. Not in the story, no, you're far from done. But in the pace, in the breath. Because by now you've noticed something odd, haven't you? This tale, this endless string of edicts and exiles, sons and spies, scrolls and shadows. It doesn't feel like ancient history anymore. It feels unsettlingly familiar. The office politics. The glass ceiling that was more like a stone one. The expectations to be graceful and brutal, poetic and practical, soft enough to soothe, sharp enough to survive. Yes, you feel it now. You've lived this in one form or another. In boardrooms, classrooms, dinner tables, anywhere someone smiled too wide and said, "That's impressive for a woman." And so did she. Wu Zetian didn't break the system. She outlasted it. But the cracks she made, they're still there. In the centuries following her death, Chinese culture struggles to decide what to do with her. She's too significant to ignore, too complicated to glorify, and too successful to be easily dismissed. So instead, she becomes a mirror. The Qing dynasty tries again to confine her legacy, rewriting history books, reshaping court rituals, subtly pushing her back into the corner as a historical anomaly. But even in their stiff, ritual-bound court, some female scholars begin slipping her name into essays and genealogy records. One writes, "If Wu can reign, then I can read." And that more than anything becomes her revolution. In the Republican era following the collapse of imperial rule in 1912, there's a new flurry of writing about her. Now she's cast as a proto-feminist, a self-made leader, a woman who ruled not because she inherited, but because she earned. It's revisionist, sure, but it's also revealing, because every generation reinvents Wu Zetian to reflect what it fears or what it hopes. And in 20th century China, as women begin entering schools and politics, she becomes a symbol again. Not always praised, often misunderstood, but impossible to forget. And then modernity. The Communist Party tries to reshape her legacy yet again. In the 1950s, she's taught in schools as both a warning and a lesson. The woman who dared defy feudal hierarchy, but who must still be critiqued through the lens of ideology. A useful tool, a complicated figure. Still, students read her name with a little spark in their chests. And across the ocean in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, plays are written. Manga is drawn. Historical dramas bloom, some painting you as a cold empress of steel, and shadows others as a romantic heroine torn between duty and love. There's even a detective novel series that casts you as the investigator in your own palace, intrigues solving mysteries with a mix of keen insight and imperial privilege. Fiction, of course, but compelling fiction, because that's what you've become, a genre. And the stele, still blank, still standing. Tourists pose beside it now. School children giggle. Guides tell embellished stories. One claims it was too powerful to be written upon. Another says it was left blank to let women of the future finish the inscription. That line becomes popular. T-shirts are printed. Poetry contests are held. A university student writes an award-winning thesis titled Blank Stone Full Voice, Wu Zetian's Challenge to Dynastic Historiography. And her conclusion? They tried to carve her legacy in silence, but the silence became the script. Because in the end, that's the paradox you left behind. You were loud in policy, but quiet in self-description. You ruled like a storm, but never claimed to be one. You were framed as arrogant, but rarely wrote of yourself. And so the world was forced to ask, who was Wu Zetian really? And every time someone answers, they reveal more about themselves than about you, because you're still here. Not just in museums or TV dramas or textbooks, but in every difficult question about power, gender, legacy, and who gets remembered. Your story isn't just a history, it's an unfinished sentence. And now let's stand beside that stele once more. The wind curls gently through the trees around your tomb. Tour groups shuffle by their footsteps, crunching lightly on gravel. A guide murmurs facts through a microphone. A little boy tosses a pebble at the stone and is quickly scolded. But the moment passes. The stone remains, still blank, still listening. You've become a destination. Not just your name, not just your tomb, but your story. Visitors arrive with offerings, paper lotus flowers, handwritten poems, tiny charms pressed from bronze. Some bow, some just stand and stare. Some touch the stele as if hoping for something to pass through their fingers, a fragment of boldness, perhaps, or resolve. And quietly your name lives on in places you never imagined. A school for girls in Shandong's named Wu Zetian Academy. Its motto is a line from your writing. The ink may fade, but the meaning deepens. A scholar in Europe translates your poetry into French. Another publishes a book comparing your reign to that of Catherine the Great. You're now shelved in libraries alongside Elizabeth I and Cleopatra, not quite similar, not quite different. You've crossed cultures, languages, and time itself, not by conquest, but by complexity. And what a strange complexity it is, because the question still remains. Were you a tyrant, a reformer, a mother, a manipulator, a genius? The answer whispered now in dozens of tongues is simple and infuriating. Yes, you were all of those and something more. You were a contradiction that functioned. You were a ruler who succeeded not in spite of being a woman, but through it. You weaponized assumptions. You rewrote every expectation. You played the game, changed the board, and still won. Even when the dice were loaded. Even when the court was filled with men who would rather have seen the empire burn than see a woman command it. You didn't just survive. You flourished. And that, more than any single edict, changed the architecture of what was possible. Historians still argue, endlessly. Some refuse to name your dynasty as legitimate. Others credit your reign with stabilizing the Tang through its most volatile decades. A few insist you were no different than any other emperor, just with better handwriting. They can't agree, which is exactly how you preferred it. Because ambiguity is a form of control. Let them squabble over your motives, your methods, your morals. Let them rewrite your story until the scrolls wear thin. You've already carved yourself into the most unassailable material, memory. In modern China, your image fluctuates. One decade you're celebrated in a state museum. The next you're removed from a curriculum for being too untraditional. A television drama depicts you as a tragic romantic heroine. A video game reimagines you as a powerful sorceress. A scholar in Beijing writes an essay titled, Wu Zetian, the emperor we needed, not the one we deserved. And still you are discussed. Every time someone says your name, a door opens. A young woman applies to civil service and quotes you in her interview. A student writes an essay and begins to question what unfit truly means. A tourist touches your stele and walks away standing a little straighter. You ruled an empire once. Now you inspire 1,000 more. Not made of land, but of possibility. And that in the end is the real legacy, not what you controlled, but what you unlocked. Back in the garden courtyard of Shangyang Palace, the magnolias still bloom. Their white petals open each spring, just as they did when you once paused beneath them, planning your next decree, your next reshuffle, your next poem. Now no one rules from here. The rooms are empty, the windows are dark, but if you stand still long enough, they say you can still hear the rustle of a scroll, the clink of a jade hairpin, the faint echo of ink meeting paper. Because while the emperors changed and dynasties fell, the lines you wrote kept moving. You see, your story didn't stop when you left the throne. It multiplied. One thread wound its way into literature tales of your rise and rule, of your quiet cleverness, your sharp silences. Some were critical, sure. Some were embellished. But none could ignore you. You had become narrative. Another thread slid into the bones of the state bureaucratic reforms, merit-based promotion, record-keeping systems that outlived even the Tang. Officials, centuries later, followed procedures you created sometimes without even knowing they came from you. A third thread, that one slipped into culture. You became image. A mural in a Qing tea house shows you seated on the dragon throne robes like waterfalls, one brow arched in wry command. A scroll from the Song dynasty paints you as an ethereal bodhisattva floating among lotus clouds. A modern artist sketches you as a warrior poet, half sword, half ink brush. All myths, all true, because you were not one version of yourself. You were layers, and each generation has peeled back a different one. Even today, your name remains provocative. In academic circles, your policies are cited in debates over early meritocracy. In pop culture, you're reimagined as everything from a symbol of feminist resistance to a case study in Machiavellian genius. TikToks and podcasts resurrect your story in 60-second summaries with sound effects and dramatic music. But the essence is unchanging. You took power in a world that told you it was impossible. And you didn't just hold it, you used it to elevate the efficient, to outwit the entitled, to turn the imperial system inside out while keeping it humming along the whole time. Historians still debate whether you were beloved or feared. But here's the thing. You never needed to be loved, only remembered. And you were, you are, you will be. There's a museum in Luoyang that houses one of your handwritten decrees. Visitors pause before the glass case. The ink has faded, but the characters still flow with a deliberate precision, tight, bold, unapologetically vertical. A child tugs at their mother's sleeve and asks, "Who wrote that?" And the answer comes soft but certain. An emperor, not a concubine, not a consort, not a placeholder. An emperor, the only one of her kind. And even now, as the magnolias bloom again, the garden remains quiet but not empty. Your story walks there still. In footsteps no one can hear. Let's return to the beginning. Not to the throne room, not to the poems, but to the quiet, dusty corner of Liju, where a young girl once sat cross-legged on a stone floor, reading by candlelight, the edges of her robe smudged with ink, the air thick with the scent of lacquered wood and distant fire. No one told her she would rule an empire. No one even told her she could. And yet here we are. Because that girl Wu Zhao didn't ask for permission. She read, she watched, she waited. And then when the time came, she stepped forward, not loudly, not violently, but inevitably. That's the thing about inevitability. It doesn't shout, it unfolds. And unfold you did? You passed through every corridor of power a woman wasn't supposed to walk, from concubine to nun, from exile to empress, and finally, unimaginably, to emperor. And what's remarkable is not just that you reached the top, but that you redefined what top meant. You didn't merely sit on the throne, you redesigned the rules, rewrote the rituals, and reprogrammed the rhythm of an entire imperial machine that had, for centuries, been run by men and made for men. You swapped out puppets for policies. You replaced ceremony with systems. You made paperwork terrifying. Your reforms were so effective, so efficient, that some ministers stopped fighting your authority simply because your government worked better than theirs did. That's the kind of leadership no stele needs to explain. And yet, the blank one still stands. Visitors continue to ask about it. Guides continue to explain that your tomb inscription was left unfinished, either by design or by tension, or by the simple fact that history could not decide what to say. You'd probably smirk at that. After all, you never really trusted historians. You trusted outcomes, rice and bowls, roads paved, armies paid, scholars examined, cities lit, fields taxed fairly well mostly, and a central government that, despite the noise, functioned. The truth of your reign was in the details. You knew that power isn't just about command, it's about continuity, and you ensured yours would last far beyond your breath. Centuries later, when the Chinese civil service expanded again, some officials quietly cited your governance structure. In the modern day, your name has been invoked in gender studies, political science management theory, even software engineering. Someone once built a debugging script and named it Empress Wu. It was very efficient, but a little ruthless, with faulty code. You've become usefully symbolic, but also deeply real. A reminder that leadership isn't inherited, it's built. And you built it stone by stone, scroll by scroll, one ink stroke at a time. You taught us that silence can be policy, that modesty can be strategy, that writing things down, really writing them, can be more powerful than any sword, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply not stepping aside. That lesson remains. In every woman who decides she doesn't need a title to make change. In every student who flips past a footnote and digs deeper. In every person, man or woman, who feels the weight of being underestimated and thinks, good. Let them. Your legacy lives there, in grit, in strategy, in silence that echoes longer than applause. Because even without your name carved into a stone, the world knows who you were. And now we enter the long after, the part of the story most rulers never get. Not a death, not a dynasty, but a drift, a slow, persistent sinking into collective memory. Not erasure, not quite. Something stranger. A presence that becomes a question. What does it mean to leave behind a world you reshaped, only to watch it reshape you in return? In the centuries after your reign, the empire kept evolving. Dynasties rose and fell like tides, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing. Each one carried traces of you, though most would never admit it. Your name was rarely said aloud in court, but your systems were imitated, modified, silently inherited. Some emperors used your bureaucracy while condemning your audacity. Some scholars used your reforms while warning girls not to read too many books. And every once in a while, someone tried to write you out entirely. But erasing you was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. You were never just one thing. The further away time moved from your life, the more versions of you multiplied. In one popular Yuan dynasty opera, you are portrayed as a vengeful spirit returning from the underworld to punish corrupt officials with poetry so sharp it causes nosebleeds. In another, you are a heavenly sage who teaches Confucius himself the proper way to rule. By the Qing dynasty, your legend splits cleanly in two. To the orthodox, you're a danger. To the artists, you're a muse. And in between, a strange silence. Your stele remains blank. Still, it has now survived weather war earthquakes and regime change. It has been painted, cleaned, prayed over, ignored, rediscovered, and photographed 1,000 times. But no one, not even the most powerful emperors after you, dared chisel a single character into it. What can they say that you haven't already proven? The paradox remains. A woman ruled and the sky did not fall. But to carve that in stone would be to admit that the unthinkable had not only happened, it had worked. And so the stone is left untouched, a testimony not to your silence but to theirs. Meanwhile, across oceans and centuries, your name travels. In Japanese court dramas, you're reimagined as a misunderstood heroine. In French revolutionary pamphlets, you're held up as proof that monarchy can wear a female face. In 20th century feminist literature, you are debated hotly. Are you a role model or a warning? Some call you opportunistic, others visionary. Some say you simply did what any man in your position would have done, but with more style. A political theorist once wrote Wu Zetian was not an emperor in spite of being a woman. She was an emperor because she refused to be defined by it. It catches on. The line is quoted in classrooms, printed on bookmarks, whispered in protests, and suddenly you're not just a historical figure anymore. You're relevance. In university lecture halls across the world, your name appears in syllabi not just for Chinese history, but for leadership studies, gender politics, and comparative governance. Students write essays titled Wu Zetian and the Architecture of Power, or the blank stele as resistance. They quote you, they critique you, they reclaim you, and through it all you remain untouched but everywhere. One modern Chinese poet writes, "She left her name on the wind, her laws on our fingers, her silence on stone. and another scribbled in chalk on a university wall reads simply, Wu Zetian ruled. Now it's your turn. Because your story isn't a period, it's an ellipsis. You ruled, you stepped down, you vanished. But your legacy, it keeps asking us the same thing over and over like a quiet knock on the edge of history's door. What will you do with the power you're told you don't deserve? There's a curious comfort in the idea that you never truly left. Not in the ghostly sense, though. Plenty of folktales insist you haunt the palace halls, correcting grammar on imperial scrolls from beyond the veil. But in the structural sense, in the way your decisions, your designs still underpin the rhythm of a civilization. And yet as the world modernizes, the rhythms change. By the 20th century, China itself has transformed. Dynasties have given way to revolutions, thrones to committees, decrees to 5-year plans, and still your name slips through. You appear in textbooks usually surrounded by cautionary vocabulary, unorthodox, controversial, unprecedented. You are footnoted with asterisks. Your reign is described with phrases like disrupted Confucian norms or challenged established gender roles. But those words do little to contain the reality, because quietly, almost reluctantly, you start showing up elsewhere, in plays performed in workers' theaters, in whispered lectures by professors who knew the value of a difficult question, in girls' middle school essays titled, Why Wu Zetian Was Right. And in those essays typed with clunky keys or scrawled in fountain pen, you become what no steely inscription could contain, possibility. The quiet radicalism of your life blooms anew in each mind that learns it. And not just in China. Across borders, your story travels. A Brazilian historian writes a monograph titled Empress of the Margins. A Korean filmmaker adapts your life into a slow-burning political thriller. A Nigerian poet writes you into a verse sequence about queens who were never crowned, only claimed. And then quietly in a library in California, a graduate student stumbles upon a dusty translation of one of your edicts. She reads it once, twice. She doesn't move for an hour. Later in her thesis, she writes, Wu Zetian did not beg to be remembered. She built a world that could not forget her. That line circles the globe. It is quoted in keynote speeches, painted on murals, whispered between friends, printed on shirts sold in activist bookstores, and somewhere beneath all that noise you remain unchanged. Still the girl who read philosophy in her father's study. Still the concubine who watched everything, said nothing, and quietly remembered everyone's mistakes. Still the empress who rebuilt the court from the inside out. Still the emperor who knew how to wield silence louder than most men wielded drums. Still the strategist who understood that power wasn't about holding the sword. It was about writing the orders no one dared disobey. And now, as the digital age accelerates, your legacy takes on yet another life. You are #fanarted, included in leadership podcasts and motivational speeches. Your name is added to lists, women who changed history, rulers who defied convention, legends who weren't supposed to exist. Even AI models are trained on your story. A new generation raised not on footnotes, but on screens learns about you through games, animated history explainers, and late-night Wikipedia dives. And what did they find? Not just a ruler, not just a woman, but a moment, a window, a question. If Wu Zetian could do it, then what can I do now? You never needed to live forever. You just needed to be remembered correctly. And maybe now, finally, that's starting to happen. Not in imperial halls, not in carved granite, but in minds, in dreams, in the quiet moment when someone reaches for more and doesn't flinch when the world says no, because that's where you've always lived. Not in monuments, but in defiance that works. So now let's imagine this. It's early morning just after a spring rain. The streets of Luoyang are slick with memory, the air scented faintly with whetstone blooming plum and the iron tang of history. A young woman walks alone, hands behind her back, tracing the path toward the gates of your tomb. She's not a scholar, not an activist, not even sure why she's here. She just heard a name once, read a line once, caught your gaze once in a museum, a mural, a meme, and it stayed. Now she stands before your blank stele, tilting her head at it like it might speak. It doesn't. Of course it doesn't. It never has. And yet there's something about it. Something that makes her want to write. Not on the stone, she'd never dare, but in her mind, in her phone's notes app, in the corners of her thoughts, where ambition often hides. She wonders what it would have felt like to walk through those palace gates in your shoes, to sit in council chambers and sign her name at the bottom of state documents, to stand in front of a room full of men all waiting for her to fail and simply not oblige them. She doesn't know the specifics of your reign, not yet, but she feels the shape of it. It's not that you had power, it's how you used it with precision, patience, and the kind of long view logic most people mistake for luck. And maybe she starts to think that kind of thinking isn't gone. That maybe power isn't always about empire or armies. Sometimes it's about permission to speak, to lead, to stay. She walks away from your Steely a little straighter, a little quieter, but something is different. Because the next time someone tells her no, that her voice is too soft, her questions too sharp, her presence too much, she remembers you. She remembers that silence can be a weapon, that waiting is a strategy, that ruling doesn't always begin with a crown, it begins with a decision. And long after the history books close, that's what your story becomes, a decision, to be written in full even if the stone remains blank. Because blank is not the absence of meaning, it's an invitation. And every person who hears your story, whether in ink on stage or in the quiet hush before sleep, gets to decide what to do with that space. You left a throne, but more importantly, you left a question. What does it look like when the impossible becomes routine? What does it sound like when power is soft-spoken, silk-wrapped, and unafraid? What happens when history stops asking, can she, and starts asking, what next? You answered with your life, and now the world whispers back. Let's walk back into the palace just one more time. Not the real one. That's long gone. Stone crumbled, paint faded, court robes folded into dust. No, this one lives somewhere else now. In memory, in language, in that strange palace built not of pillars but of reputation, where rulers live as rumors, as adjectives, as cautionary tales and calendar entries. And here you are, still in residence, still causing debate at the long banquet table of history, where emperors sit stiffly while philosophers and teenagers and professors argue over legacies like it's a card game no one agreed on the rules for. You, of course, would win that game. Not with volume, but with silence and paperwork. Because here's the truth that keeps slipping through their fingers. You didn't have to burn anything down. You simply rewired it all. You turned the machinery of empire inward, redesigned the gears, sharpened the pens, and made sure the imperial machine ran smoother under your rule than it ever had before. And for centuries, even those who tried to hate you had to admit you were competent. That word, so unglamorous, so powerful. You didn't win because you were flashy. You won because you knew how to listen, wait, adapt, and govern. You built coalitions, you solved famines, you balanced temple politics with tax reform. You wrote with a steel brush and a spine made of tact. And now, centuries later, that's the part they keep coming back to. Not the scandals, not the rumors. The results, because historians might argue over your morals, but no one can deny your output. And so you remain half remembered, half claimed, fully studied. In university syllabi from Boston to Beijing. In stage plays where actors wear too much eyeliner and still can't match your presence. In academic conferences where they still argue over your motives, but unanimously agree on one point. She changed everything. Even the emperors that followed could not fully escape your shadow. In fact, they often ruled in reaction to it. Policies drafted to restore order were often reversals of your reforms. Ceremonies were reshaped to ensure no woman would ever do what you did again. And yet, the system you touched never truly snapped back. It couldn't. Because once you've been ruled by someone outside the rules look a little shakier, a little more negotiable. And slowly over time, that destabilizing idea spreads across the empire, across generations, until the idea that only one kind of person can lead becomes a question instead of a truth. And questions are dangerous, just like you were. A question with a throne, a ruler with no blueprint, a woman with a pen sharp enough to redraw borders without moving an army. That's what you were, and that's why you remain. Not in the incense smoke, not even in the tomb, but in the question, still unanswered, still uncomfortable, still standing. Let's sit for a while. No more thrones, no more decrees, just stillness. You are not Wu Zetian the emperor now, not the strategist, not the scandal, not the subject of academic conference papers with footnotes longer than the arguments themselves. You're just the woman behind the curtain, behind the brush, behind the breath it took to ask, why not me? And that question still echoes, because for all the noise surrounding your legacy, scrolls written, Scrolls burned, scrolls rewritten. You left something rarer than a dynasty, a blueprint for disbelief. Not disbelief in government or law, but disbelief in the roles we're told to play. You didn't just defy a system, you functioned inside it better than anyone was prepared for. You used its own rules like weapons. You didn't change the game from the outside. You beat it from within. That's why you're dangerous. And that's why you're necessary. In a world where power has always been taught in a male voice, you spoke in ink, in structure, in pauses. You governed not by shouting, but by editing the shouting before it became policy. You made people nervous not because you were chaotic, but because you were stable in the wrong body. Because you didn't crumble. Because you didn't need permission. Because every time a door was closed, you built a corridor around it. That's the kind of power that leaves no monuments, only models. And now they study you not for your charisma, but your flowcharts. Not your wrath, but your reforms. Not your scandal, but your strategy. There's a modern phrase tossed around in business schools and leadership workshops. She's playing chess while they're playing checkers. You were designing the board. Now your story lives in fragments. In essays, in operas, in fictional reboots and historical retractions, in the soft clicks of search engines when someone types first female ruler China and is sent inevitably to you, and they stare because the portrait doesn't match the mythology, because the image looks ordinary, but ordinary was your disguise. The robe, the scrolls, the ceremony, all camouflage for something far more radical, competence where they least expected it. It's why they feared you, why they still debate you, and why to this day no emperor, no committee, no historian has carved a word into your stele, because any word they choose would feel smaller than the story it's meant to contain. So the stone stays blank. And that blankness, that's your final trick. It invites each generation to fill it in for themselves. To ask, what would I write here? A curse, a hymn, a warning, a mirror. You left them all space to decide. And that may be the most powerful thing a ruler has ever done, to give away the last word. Let's talk about forgetting. Not erasure, not censorship, just the slow natural erosion of detail over time. Even the grandest empires fade into the background hum of history. The names blur, the titles stack, the scrolls dry up and crumble. That's just how memory works. And yet you persist, not because every student can recite the year you took the throne, not because your tomb is the most visited or your poetry the most anthologized, but because every now and then someone sits alone late at night and thinks, she did it anyway. That's your story in 6 words. When the laws said no, when tradition said impossible, when even the heavens were quiet, you did it anyway. And that seed, that tiny act of refusal, it grows, even in places where your name isn't spoken, even in hearts that don't know your history, even in rooms where people say, that's not your role, or you're being too ambitious, or it's never been done before. You live there, not in stone, in subtext. That's the secret of your afterlife. You're no longer a ruler. You're a reference point, a nod, a raised eyebrow, a moment of held breath before someone challenges the rules in a room that wasn't designed for them. And in that moment, they don't need to know everything about you. They don't need your timeline, your bloodline, your exact policies. They just need to know you existed. That someone sat on the throne and didn't apologize for it. That someone was underestimated and overperformed. That someone rewrote the rules and the structure stayed standing. Historians still debate whether your rule was good for China. What they forget is your rule was good at ruling. You made things work. You delivered grain. You appointed competent ministers. You stabilized borders. You improved literacy. You raised taxes and loyalty somehow at the same time. You ran a bureaucracy so tightly that even your enemies had to follow it for years after you were gone. And you did it while being called everything from witch to deviant to divine. You wore those titles like a crown. You understood that survival wasn't about being liked. It was about being needed. And in a world that had never needed a woman on the throne before, you made yourself indispensable. That is why you endure. Because even now, especially now, we are still learning what that means. To lead not through fear or charisma or lineage, but through strategy, through endurance, through patience that outlasts resistance. You built a legacy not from victory, but from longevity. And when the dust settles over every argument, the scroll's yellow, and the stele remains uncarved, the truth still rings out. She ruled, she lasted, and she never gave the world a simple answer. There's a story some tell now, not officially, not in textbooks, but in quiet corners, classroom whispers, and museum side tours. It goes like this. A girl kneels before the stele at Wu Zetian's tomb. She's not praying, she's reading. Not the stone, but what isn't there. The silence, the absence, the invitation. And when she stands, she doesn't say a word. She simply nods, turns away, and begins writing. No one knows her name. But that's the point, because Wu Zetian's legacy was never about her name alone. It was about what her name unlocked. Every forgotten daughter who asked for more. Every civil servant who rose on talent instead of family. Every record keeper who tightened the rules so tightly, even corruption couldn't slip through. Every poem that dared mention politics. Every law rewritten in favor of function over form. You see, when you ruled, you didn't just build temples and issue taxes. You reformatted reality for everyone who came after you. You altered the assumptions. And assumptions once altered rarely return to their original shape. Even when dynasties tried to restore the old order, your silhouette remained like a watermark under every page. They tried to unsee you. They couldn't. And centuries later, when women began taking exams, leading organizations, holding offices, they didn't always cite you, but they continued you. Even now, your influence moves like ink in water, visible only when the light hits just right, but always spreading. A CEO quotes you in a boardroom slide deck, not because she studied Tang history, but because your words, sharp, precise, unyielding, still echo in management guides. A playwright reimagines your final days as a chamber piece, a single voice, narrating legacy and loss. A teenager finds your name online and draws you into their sketchbook robe, flowing eyes alert, captioned, simply she wasn't supposed to, but she did. That's how you survive now. Through gestures, through emulation, through quiet, firm inheritance. And maybe that's the final paradox. You once sat on the highest seat of power visible to all absolute in command. And now, you rule more subtly, through systems, through thought. Through the unkillable idea that competence can be feminine, that authority can wear hairpins, that dynasties might fall, but design holds. That's what lasts. Not glory, not conquest, but structure. Your greatest legacy isn't your crown, it's your spreadsheet. It's the policy reform still used in bureaucracies, 300 years later. It's the decision to reward talent over birth, a decision still unfinished in our own time. It's the blank stele standing tall in the mountain mist saying nothing and daring the world to fill in the rest. You could have written your own epitaph. You had the poets, the scribes, the power, but instead you left us space, so we could write ourselves into it. Let's imagine just for a moment that the stone speaks. Not aloud, it doesn't need to, but if you lean in close, if you listen not with your ears, but with that part of your mind that recognizes boldness, when it sees it, you might hear it say, she didn't wait to be chosen, because that's the truth that hides beneath the myths and monuments. You didn't win because someone handed you a crown. You positioned yourself, you outlasted rivals, you outperformed expectations, and when the moment came, you didn't hesitate. You simply assumed the space. It's not that no one else could have done what you did. It's that no one else dared long enough, smart enough, or patiently enough to pull the whole thing off without losing control of the script. Because the palace, for all its gold and ritual, was a theater. And you were a playwright in disguise. You rewrote dynastic tragedy as pragmatic governance. You recast the role of woman from supporting character to sovereign lead. You directed every act, edited the dialogue, controlled the lights. And the curtain never fell on you, even when you stepped off stage. That's the part few understand. You abdicated the throne, but you never gave up the role. Not really. Because even in retirement, even in silence, your name shaped the moves of others. Your structure held. Your edits stayed in place. Your presence haunted the architecture of power like a quiet rhythm no one could break. Historians tried to flatten you. Dynasties tried to absorb or forget you. But every now and then someone sits down with the raw materials of your life. Those timelines, those names, those policies, and realizes, wait, this wasn't chaos, this was choreography. You weren't lucky, you were deliberate. And your example has become a kind of litmus test. When someone reads your story and feels threatened, it says something about how they define power. When someone reads it and feels inspired, it says something else. And when someone reads it and says nothing, just gets up and goes to do something bold, quiet, strategic, efficient, that says the most. Because that's what your legacy really is. A call to action with no trumpet. A rebellion dressed in record keeping. A throne built on scrolls, not swords. And a reminder, unspoken but absolute: you don't have to be invited to lead. You just have to be ready when the world looks the other way. Let's turn now to the overlooked, the tiny things. Not the thrones or reforms or trials, but the moments too small for scrolls. The ones no historian bothered to write down, like the way you adjusted your sleeves just so before entering court, or the way you paused before sealing an edict, not to doubt yourself, but to ensure the ink was dry and the silence in the room complete, like the servant girl who once dropped a teacup in your presence and braced for punishment only to hear you calmly say, "Then we will use silver ones from now on." These aren't recorded, but they live. Because power is not just what you command, it's how you make people feel in the moments no one else is watching. And in those moments, you built something that couldn't be destroyed by dynasties or dust. You built influence, not just by ruling, but by being observed, judged, admired, resented, misquoted, feared, emulated. You became a mirror for every minister, scholar, concubine, general, and child who looked at you and thought, so it's possible after all. And once seen, that image of a woman leading not through ornament but order could not be unseen. It lived in rumor, in resistance, in revision. Even your enemies couldn't agree on how to criticize you. Some called you too ruthless, others too indulgent. Some claimed you loved poetry too much, others not enough. Some called you a traitor to family, others a mother of the nation. But no one called you irrelevant. And that's the deepest kind of power, the kind that redefines the terms of engagement. You didn't just survive in a system built to exclude you. You made the system rely on you. And when it no longer served your vision, you reshaped it, piece by piece, position by position, title by carefully awarded title, until your name wasn't an exception. It was an expectation. And even after you abdicated, even after the throne returned to your son, officials still invoked your rules. They followed your precedents. They argued over your legacy to justify their positions, because you weren't just a person. You had become policy. And policy, once written well enough, tends to outlast even its authors. That's how bureaucracies work. That's how empires persist. And that's how you stayed. Not by holding the brush forever, but by writing so cleanly that no one dared replace your script. The most dangerous thing you ever did was not rule. It was rule well, because that proves it wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of indulgence by the mandate of heaven. It was earned. And that is harder to erase than any name. Step into the archives, if you will. Deep within the quiet stacks of a university library, past the digital terminals and curated exhibits in a forgotten corner where scroll facsimiles gather dust, you'll find a slim, unlabeled volume. It doesn't look like much. Its cover is plain. Its edges are worn. But inside, neatly copied by hand, is a collection of imperial edicts from the late 7th century. The handwriting is meticulous, the phrasing precise. You recognize it immediately, not because it boasts or glitters, but because it functions. This is how your voice survives, not just in stories, but in systems, in documents, in outcomes. It's easy to mythologize you as a symbol. Much harder but more telling is to trace how your words worked. That's the part many overlook. You weren't a disruptor in the way rebellions are. You didn't burn the institution down. You simply ran it better than anyone else. You ruled with structure. Your reforms weren't designed to impress poets. They were made to deliver rice to villages faster, to ensure border generals got their supplies on time, to make sure tax revenue reached the capital intact. And in doing so, you accomplished something almost no leader, male or female, ever does. You made government boringly effective, which, as it turns out, is incredibly threatening. Because once people realize a woman can govern not only just as well as a man, but more calmly, more efficiently, more consistently, the excuses crumble, the traditions unravel, and the gatekeepers scramble to put the doors back up again. That's why your memory was suppressed. Not because you were bad at ruling, but because you were too good. Too good to ignore, too good to replicate, too good to be allowed to stand unchallenged in the records without someone attaching a warning label. And so Wu Zetian, Empress Regnant of Zhou, the only female emperor in China's history, footnoted with controversial, ruthless, extraordinary aberration. But what if the footnote is wrong? What if the real aberration wasn't you, but the centuries that tried to forget you? Because the more closely scholars study your reign, the edicts, the infrastructure, the appointments, the more a quiet consensus builds. You were no accident. You were a system designed to last longer than your reign. And it did. Elements of your governance inspector rotations, complaint boxes, curated civil exams lasted hundreds of years after your death. The Tang revived many of them. Later dynasties quietly absorbed them. Even in today's bureaucracies, echoes of your structures remain. No statue needed, no temple necessary, just results. You didn't have to be eternal. You just had to be useful. And useful you were, even now when policymakers study administrative efficiency in imperial China. Your reign appears not as a curiosity, but as a model. Not a scandal, but a case study. Not a detour, but a milestone. That's legacy, not the part they sing about. The part they can't operate without. And now let's step outside the scrolls. Step beyond the palaces and poems. Step past the timelines and titles. Let's stand briefly in the present. Not the imagined one, the real one. It's evening in Xi'an. The streets are glowing with soft neon layered over stone paths that once echoed with the footsteps of envoys and scholars. Teenagers on scooters pass by a centuries-old wall. A grandmother sells sugar cakes near a subway entrance. And somewhere not far from the bustle, your tomb still waits in the quiet. Visitors come, some to honor, some just curious. A tour guide waves his hand toward your blank stele and says, "No inscription." She left it for history to decide. But history doesn't get the final say. People do. And people, they're still deciding, scroll by scroll, post by post, whisper by whisper. Every girl who learns about you in a school book and raises her hand a little higher. Every reader who sees you called controversial and asks, compared to whom? Every quiet mind that wonders, why haven't there been more? Because that's the thread no one's been able to cut the curiosity you left behind. Not just about you, but about what else might be possible if the rules weren't written in ink that only favors one kind of hand. And in that curiosity you endure, you are no longer the only one who sat on a throne, but you are still the one whose story questions every throne that came after. And your legacy, it's not carved into cliffs. It's tucked into questions. The kind a professor asks a class of first-year students, what do we make of Wu Zetian? The kind a young woman asks herself as she looks up from a textbook and sees her own reflection staring back with just enough daring in her eyes. The kind a culture quietly chews on century after century, unsure whether to praise you, blame you, erase you, or make you into something poetic. So they do all four. They canonize you, then critique you. They dramatize you, then dissect you. They villainize you, then build monuments to your efficiency. And you left no rebuttal, only results. Only that blank stele, only that empire that by every metric ran better under your control than it did under the men before or after you. Only a legacy strong enough that no consensus has ever been able to hold it still. Because you were never meant to be summarized. You were meant to be studied, questioned, rewritten, passed on. And in doing so, passed forward. So, on this neon-lit evening, in the shadow of ancient roads and digital screens, a teenager snaps a photo of your tomb, looks at it, and types one sentence in the caption. The throne was real, so was she. And just like that, you move again. Let's descend now, not into endings, but into quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, but presence, stripped of noise. A stillness that doesn't signal death, but the moment after impact, when dust settles, breath returns, and we start to understand what just happened. Because Wu Zetian was never just a ruler. She was an event. And not in the flashy headline-grabbing sense, but in the tectonic sense. She moved something foundational. Something below the surface of what people believed was possible, acceptable, inevitable. And long after she stepped down, that movement continued. Not in speeches or monuments, in subtle expectations, in the way bureaucrats conducted themselves after she made accountability lethal, in the way girls looked at books differently after hearing her name, in the way even her enemies used her reforms grudgingly, quietly, permanently. Your rule became embedded, not like a sword in stone, but like grain in wood. You reshaped the pattern, and once changed it could never go back. That's the hardest kind of power to dismantle. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't need to, because it's already in everything. And maybe that's the final answer to the stele. It's blank because there's no need to write your story in stone when it's already been written in structure, in the layout of the court, in the roots of grain. in the order of civil exams, in the shape of modern governance itself. Your legacy doesn't just persist, it functions, like a gear still turning inside a machine that designers barely understand. And that's why people still whisper about you, not just out of awe, but out of unease. Because if you were possible once, you're possible again. And if everything they were told about the natural order was wrong, once it might be wrong still. You are not a relic. You are a question that won't stay buried. And questions, when left unanswered, become seeds. Now those seeds have taken root. In novels, in protest signs, in essays, in late-night study sessions, in the careful precision of a young woman revising her thesis to include your footnote, in the boldness of someone applying for a job she was told she wasn't qualified for, in the silent pause before someone decides they've had enough of asking for permission. That's where you are now. Not in temples, not in textbooks, in decisions. In the moment before someone says yes to themselves. That's the afterlife you earned, not with bloodline, but with blueprint. And now we reach the final chamber. No coronation, no curtain call, just a soft hush settling over the palace of your legacy. The stories have been told, the scrolls unrolled, the questions asked, and still, you remain. Not in bronze, not in marble, but in motion. Because what you created wasn't just a reign, it was a trajectory. A line moving forward through centuries of resistance and rediscovery, bending history not with force, but with function. There was no magic in what you did. Only clarity, only structure, only the bold, impossible act of stepping into a space that was never meant to hold you and fitting it so well they had to change the shape of the room to explain your presence. That's what lives on now. In every structure that still echoes with your logic, in every debate that still uses your name, in every girl who's told no and answers with strategy instead of surrender, you ruled for decades, but your reign, the real one, has never stopped. It continues each time someone sits where they weren't expected to, each time someone makes a system more fair, each time a name that shouldn't have lasted does. That's what you did. And in doing it, you taught us something no monument could express. That power isn't what you hold. It's what you leave behind that still works. And now as the lights dim, as the scroll closes, as your voice softens into silence, let's return to that stele one final time. The wind brushes past it. The moss clings at its base. The stone stands tall, blank, unapologetic. And in that absence of inscription, in that refusal to summarize one truth, rings louder than any carved praise. You were not meant to be written down. You were meant to be carried forward. So now let your breath slow. Let your shoulders ease. Let your mind drift gently through the echoes of a palace long turned to dust. The incense smoke fades. The scrolls are rolled away. The robes are folded. And in that stillness, you feel it, that quiet strength, like warm stone beneath your feet. The weight of someone who came before you, who didn't ask, who didn't wait, who simply did. And now you carry her story, not as burden, but as blueprint. Let it whisper in the back of your thoughts when you step into unfamiliar rooms. Let it rise in your spine when you're underestimated. Let it remind you that sometimes the most powerful legacy is the one that makes people say, I didn't know that was possible until now. You don't need a crown. You don't need a title. You don't need to be written in stone. You are enough. And whatever you decide to build, whatever seat you choose to sit, in whatever sentence you choose to write, know this, she's already made room for you, and the world, whether it's ready or not, will remember, sleep well, traveler, and dream in strategy,